Welcome to the Devotional on Romans chapter 6. I'm Gary Bradshaw from Lifehouse Church, and I trust that you'll be blessed this morning as we read out of verse 14. It says, "For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace." And it's interesting that Paul doesn't use the word sin. He doesn't say you're not under sin anymore. He says you're no longer under the law. And the question is, why would he use the word law and as opposed to what we expected him to say was sin? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that the strength of sin is the law. And in Romans chapter 7, he's going to tell us that sin was strengthened by trying to keep the law. And what he's trying to say there is like you just try to keep a special resolution or a New Year's resolution, and we find out how strong sin really is and how strong our flesh is. And so the fact is that living by or focusing on the laws basically takes us back to the flesh, which is Galatians 3 verse 3. And this does not mean that we don't put principles in place and guidelines to help us, but the New Testament is not a law book. It's not this law-keeping book or this exhaustive code of words. It describes these guidelines, and then the Holy Spirit leads us in the way that God has called us into. So what's the difference between law and grace? Well, what the law requires this, or the law is this hard and stoic taskmaster. And as opposed to grace, which is this like personal friend and counselor by the leading of the Holy Spirit. The law's content is something of a 10 commandments, and the 10 commandments are only 1% of all the commandments in terms of the law as a whole. Whereas under grace, there's very few of those laws that are applicable. They're different levels. The law is a level that is actually a very low level, whereas the level required to be lived out under grace is a much higher level of holiness. And that brings us into our next point, is that the grace of God empowers us to say no to ungodliness. It empowers us to be able to live out that life where the law doesn't give us any power whatsoever. And there's a different motivation too. The law terrifies us. It's actually bound by this fear motivation. If you don't, there'll be punishment, as opposed to grace, which is love-based, and it draws us into what God has for us. There's also a different availability of forgiveness. There's the law doesn't provide a forgiveness for major sins, whereas grace does. And so what we've seen throughout Romans chapter 6 up until now, from verse 1 to 13, is that grace does whatever needs to be done to get the job done. And the grace of God kind of gives us the sense of God's presence. And it works all things to the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes. And it does it in the most surprising, unexpected ways. The Bible is constantly speaking about this grace of God. In Ephesians chapter 1, it's the exceeding riches of his grace. It's the unsearchable riches of Christ in Ephesians chapter 2. And it's grace upon grace. It's this one expression of grace after the other, as it says in John chapter 1 and verse 16. And 1 Peter 4 verse 10 says it talks of the manifold grace of God. It's like this varied ways in which grace flows and takes care of us. And I love to think of all the triumphant ways in which grace has come, its twistings and its turnings, and the unexpected ways in which God deals with us. And Moses is a perfect example, the story of Moses, where Pharaoh wants to kill all the children and get asked, make sure that all these babies are thrown into the river. And Moses' mom obeys, but she just puts him in a basket. And how God takes this basket and brings the basket to the feet of Pharaoh's daughter. And not only that, but Pharaoh's daughter then hires Moses' mother to take care of him and pays her. That's the grace of God. It guarantees that we shall not be ruled over by sin anymore. And it's not about duty or obligation. And it's not about something that we hope to happen. It has already happened. And God's grace rules and reigns in our lives. It's not this feeble prop. It's a mighty king. It's a mighty master. And I love the fact that sin shall not rule over us anymore, because grace now rules over us. And the greatest thing that grace does is it protects us. It begins a work and it completes it. It rescues us from attacks. It brings us through and will ensure that we are brought into the final heavenly kingdom of God. We shall not perish because God has us and Jesus has us in his hand, and we will not be snatched out of it. And God is determined to bring us to holiness and bring us into heaven. And it's not by the law, but it's by grace. I trust this has blessed you. And won't you hit the subscribe button, and we'll be doing these devotionals right the way up through to chapter 8 of Romans. Have an amazing day. See you soon. Bye.